Welcome back. It's time to talk about genes, culture, and gender, and this is Chapter 5. Okay, so first we're going to begin by talking a little bit about the concepts of behavior genetics and evolutionary psychology. So let's dive into that. First off, behavior genetics. This might be a term that you've never heard of before. Maybe in your introductory psychology class, if you took it from me, you might have heard of it, but a lot of people don't really talk about behavior genetics too much. This is our ability to predict individual differences from a combination of heredity and environment. So when we talk about individual differences, we're talking about why some of us are more outgoing and some of us are more shy, or those kinds of differences. Like why aren't we all the same? Right? We're made up of 99.7% or something matching DNA. Why don't we all behave the same way or have the same personalities or have the same likes and dislikes and things like that? So we take into account genes, and then we take into account your environment and how your genes and your environment interact to produce your particular constellation of traits and behaviors and attitudes and so on. All right, so I keep saying genes. Genes are the building blocks of heredity, and ultimately your development is dependent on your genes. So in each of your cells of your body, in the nucleus of those cells are chromosomes. And on each chromosome is the double helix of DNA that contain the individual genes that guide your development, your skin color, your eye color, your hair texture, your height, your weight. All of these things are directed, at least to certain extents, by your genes. They can be turned on and off by the environment. They can also be turned on and off by the presence or absence of other genes. So when we have, on our DNA helix, a gene that maybe favors finer textured hair, and then also on our DNA helix, a gene that favors curly hair, you may end up with a much different appearance on that hair, like maybe a lot curlier hair than if you had a gene for coarser hair combined with a curly hair gene, things like that. So other genes can impact the way that the genes that you carry actually manifest themselves. All right. Let's talk a little bit about twins. They are our genetic experiments that happen naturally. Nobody makes twins well, I guess they do nowadays make twins on purpose. I'm sorry, I almost said something that was false, right? But most twins in the world exist, by accident. And so it's really advantageous that they exist because researchers can sort of use them as a way of determining the relative role of genes and the relative role of environment on different kinds of outcomes. So first off, let's define the two main types of twins. There are identical twins, which are created when a single sperm fertilizes a single egg, and during the normal duplication process that occurs when you go from a single-celled organism to the millions of cells that the baby will have at birth. At some point in that division process, the cells actually start to form into two separate individuals, and they replicate normally and end up with two individuals who carry, for all intents and purposes, the exact same genes. And so one way that we know a twin pair might be identical is that they're the same sex, because all identical twins are the same sex, because all of their genes are in common, and sex is determined by the 23rd pair of chromosomes. And if both chromosomes are X's, then you get a girl, and if one's an X and one's a Y, then you get a boy. So we know that they have to be the same sex if they have all their genes in common, right? But there are other factors that go into identical twins that make them more similar than they might be otherwise. We'll talk a little bit about that, the importance of the prenatal environment. If you look at this picture, you see that these twins have like little pink ropes coming out of them attaching to that pink structure on the left side of the diagram. That pink structure is the placenta, and those ropes are their umbilical cords. That placenta is where they collect nutrition, oxygen. They drop off any waste that needs to be removed, and mom's bloodstream takes it away and stuff like that. So when you have identical twins who are both attached to the same placenta, you would imagine that they would have a more similar experience in the womb than twins who have different placenta, which might be in better or worse positions on the uterus for nutrition and oxygen and stuff like that. And so you can get more variability in the prenatal experience if you have different placentas. Identical twins can actually have different placentas. A lot of people used to think that to be an identical twin, you had to have a single placenta for the two babies, and it turns out that that's false. Really, it's a matter of how soon after conception the individuals separate. If they separate earlier, they're going to have their own placentas. If they separate a little later, they'll have the same placenta and their own amniotic sacs, which are illustrated in this diagram with that white bubble around each little fetus. If they separate a little later, they'll be on the same placenta and in the same amniotic sac. So you can imagine that would be a really similar prenatal uterine environment, right? Where they're floating in the same water, they can touch each other a lot more readily. I mean, as they develop, they're going to be shoved up against each other anyway, but they can interact with each other in ways if they share an amniotic sac that they can't do if they don't. So we really need to keep in mind how important the prenatal environment is when we talk about environmental influence. But anyway, so we've got our identical twins. A simple way to remember them is 100% of their genes in common. With fraternal twins, they occur when mom has released 2 eggs in the same menstrual cycle, and 2 different sperm have fertilized those 2 different eggs. So basically what you've got is regular siblings, but they're in the womb at the same time. So they share about 50% of their genes in common. And like regular siblings, they can be the same sex, they can be the opposite sex or the other sex. It's all just like regular siblings, except for that they share this prenatal environment, right? And then they also, because they're the same age, a lot of times they're perceived as looking more similar to each other than they might have been perceived if they had been 2 or 3 years different in age. So the environment might treat them more similarly even after they're born, right? Because they look kind of similar, or because they are treated like a group. Well, the twins, right? Anybody who is a twin is probably familiar with, you and your sibling being called the twins. I mean, all of us get called the kids, but I think that might, if you have multiple children in the family, but I think that might be a little different than being called the twins. I think there's a bigger impact to that as far as how the environment regards those individuals and then as a result treats those individuals. So for the fraternal twins, the prenatal environment is more similar than regular siblings because they're obviously in there at the same time. So they would be at the same time being affected by what mom eats and does and stressors that she's experienced and things like that. And then also, once they're born, the environment treats them more similarly than regular siblings would be treated. So fraternal twins have the same amount of genes in common as regular siblings do, but they have more overlap in their environmental experiences. Identical twins have more genes in common than fraternal twins, right? Twice as much, all of them, but they have the same kind of shared environment in the womb, and then also that the environment treats them very similarly and stuff after birth. One thing about fraternal twins I also want to throw in here is that they always have their own placenta. So there's always that slightly different prenatal experience compared to, let's say, an identical twin set that's on the same placenta and has the same amniotic sac. So those are our 2 types of twins that we're going to be really focusing on when we talk about what we have discovered as a function of studying identical twins versus fraternal twins. And unfortunately, this research was first kick-started by a study in Minnesota where they realized that during the 30s and 40s, when moms were giving their babies up for adoption, if they gave birth to multiple children, the children weren't necessarily kept together and adopted together. They were oftentimes separated and sent to households that, maybe wanted a baby but didn't really want twins, because that's a lot, right? And so they were like, well, we'll just separate them out and it doesn't matter anyway. Environment's all that matters was the perspective at the time. And so the kids will be raised by their families. Well, in the 80s, they were starting to bring these kids back together now as adults. and reuniting them and looking at, psychologically, how similar or different they were as a function of, having been reared in separate households. Now, just to manage your expectations a little bit, I want you to remember that, to adopt a child, there has been for decades, some hoops that parents have to go through to show that they're fit. They have the resources to support the children. Back then, all children were adopted into families that were their same race. So the families might not have been as different as you might be thinking. A lot of times we think, oh, just a random family took a child. But it's not quite as random as you might be thinking. There was probably a favoring towards middle class, married couples, a lot of, things that are desirable for a secure family to be adopting a child made it very similar for their experiences. Now, to play devil's advocate and say the other side, some of these children were adopted and then moved to other countries or to other parts of the country, things like that. And so I think we can definitely make an argument for they had different cultural experiences, even if their families were very similar to each other, sort of on paper. So once these adults were reunited, some of them for as much as up to 4 years before they started to be studied, they did find that identical twins who share 100% of their genes in common and are always the same sex are more alike than fraternals who, for the purposes of the study, they only looked at same-sex pairs. On things like personality traits, I mentioned extroversion a little earlier, right? How sociable it really seems to be the key component of extroversion that they really matched on. Neuroticism, which is sort of a measure of emotional stability, how, tending towards depression or how changeable the person's mood is. So these two personality traits seem to be related to genetic factors. Behavior outcomes. This is an interesting one, such as the rate of divorce, right? You might think, well, that can't possibly have anything to do with genes. But there has been a lot of research that has shown that people who are higher in neuroticism are more likely to end up divorcing, and especially if both members of the couple are high in neuroticism, the rates of divorce are much higher. So it's possible that it could be this personality trait that is underlying the likelihood of divorce. It's also possible that having certain kinds of traits attracts certain kinds of partners, right? And certain kinds of partners are more likely to get divorced, right? So there's a lot of interactions of a lot of different things that could maybe explain something like what seems so much like a choice and so much unrelated to genes might actually be, moderated by genes and, sort of this cascade of things that happen when you have a personality style or an approach to the world that is set up by your genes. It may cause certain tumbles of other things to happen contextually. Abilities like overall intelligence test scores. So sort of just classic academic kinds of intelligence seem to be very strongly predicted by genes. So identical twins, if you know one of the identical twins' intelligence test scores, you will have an 85% chance of being right. If you guess that the other twin who was not reared with this twin, they were raised in another household and had different experiences, 85% chance that they will have the same score, that you'll be right if you guess that they have the same score. So these kinds of basic skills might be very much set up in our genes and pretty impervious to the effects of environment. Another way to look at this same question is to flip it. And instead of saying, let's find people who share biology and bring them together, who were raised in separate environments, what if instead we look at people who don't share biology but were raised in a context together? So looking at adoptive families. So what they have found is that by the age of 16, it's really critical for you to keep in mind that a lot of the things I'm talking about really only start to manifest themselves in adulthood. When we're little kids, we're pretty changeable. We display behaviors that may not be characteristic of us for the rest of our lives. Once we get to about the age of 16, we start to settle into ourselves. And by the age of 30, we definitely are starting to show a lot of consistency. And what they have found is that people who were adopted are less like their adoptive parents on things like math skills or intelligence or personality traits, and they are more like their actual biological parents. So in the long run, genes seem to win out on some of these objective measures of personality and intelligence and things like that. So it looks from these things that I've been talking about like genes are the most important thing and that environment doesn't matter. Like it kind of sounds like I'm making that case, but please do not be confused. I'm not making that case. In the next little segment, let's come back and let's start to talk about the role of culture, starting with our family culture and then going out into the larger culture that might be impacting us.